a man who they say he murdered 3. Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Do werewolves drink coffee? How about vampires? In my book, This Sucks, the hero drinks a lot of coffee after discovering a large stash during the Battle of Vienna in 1566. This was one of my first tries at humor fiction, and, well, I hope I did a good job. It got kind of involved. The Organic Man Coffee Trike has the best coffee in the universe, and if you haven't tried it, you've never really been a coffee drinker. 45 is 01 McPherson if you can make the drive, or organicmancoffeetrike.shop for the rest of you. It's that time of year again. My favorite holiday is coming up. All the good movies and a lot of bad ones are on TV. Kids are getting ready to transform from one little monster into another. I already decorated my yard. In fact, I did it about 2, 3 weeks ago. Our neighborhood, we set tables along the street and we hand out candy that way. No bell ringing needed. That way you get to see the kids running back and forth, and sometimes it's pretty entertaining. Get to see the adults running back and forth sometimes, and some of them are pretty entertaining too. We run back and forth to see who has the coolest decorations and who still has candy. I usually set up at about 4, but I have an event at the Johnson High School, so I might be running a bit late. I did a show about werewolves on March 22nd, 2019. Lots of old stories from long ago. Vic Hermanson dropped his latest podcast, and the first half was on werewolves, and it got me to thinking. I need to do another show. Vic was away taking care of a sick family member, and Annabelle Lee was considering moving over to my podcast. That would have been great for the first few episodes, right up until she started waking me up in the middle of the night with ideas for shows. Vic was visiting East Germany about 1992, after it was no longer a part of the Soviet Union. As he said, any country that puts democratic in their name is a bunch of communists, and the folks in charge control everything with an iron fist. Communism and socialism are great as long as you're in the 1% that controls everything and everyone else. Vic met an old soldier who liked to play chess and talk. His English was excellent, and Vic lost a lot of matches as he listened to stories from the former GDR. Those less bright folks who think socialism is a good thing, go talk to people who lived and suffered under it, and then tell me what you think. Colonel Zimmerman, not his real name, but that's what Vic calls him, told Vic about how he and his men kept the Iron Curtain in check. Guard towers, surveillance cameras, and barbed wire in populated areas, and werewolves in the country. Let's see if I can say this right. Werewolves. I sound more like Terry Garr from Young Frankenstein, but that's how the colonel would say it. Werewolves. Colonel Zimmerman told Vic the Grenztruppen der DDR were using werewolves to patrol the urban areas where troops just couldn't or wouldn't work. Any German citizen trying to escape from the friendly constraints of the commies would be killed and probably eaten by a man wolf in the employ of the government. Would anybody do such things? Just consider all the nasty things our own government did in the name of national security or the advancement of their idea of what the world should look like. Where would the GDR get a hold of werewolves? How would they control them? And who else might be using monsters to enhance their military? According to old records, around 1640, the German city of Greifswald, now I'm starting to talk like I speak German, Greifswald became overrun with werewolves. Greifswald is a town in northeastern Germany, well behind where the Iron Curtain would be built. Here's a funny little thing to think about. I typed in Iron Curtain, and the web search took me to a Target website. Target as in the chain store. Well, what does Target have to do with the Iron Curtain? Makes you wonder. Getting back to the story. The story goes the werewolves living in and around the town had gotten out of hand. When is a werewolf in hand, I wonder? The population was being targeted by these man beasts, and it was dangerous to step outside after dark. Notice I didn't mention that it was on a full moon. Uh, the moon had nothing to do with it. When the sun went down, the werewolves came out. These creatures were out any time as soon as the sun went down. These werewolves were described as being huge wolves that during the day looked just like any man. There were all kinds of theories as to how to recognize a werewolf. Most were just made up on the spot. Person has hair on the palm of their hands, or they have very sharp canines, or you dream it up. That's how you identify a human werewolf. The idea of a wolf man was found in many areas, but most common creatures looked like men until they turned into wolves, and then they looked like wolves, not just great big, tall, two-legged, hairy wolfmen. At the time, the area around Greifswald was recovering from the 30 Years' War, and it was under control of Sweden. It was a college town, and the students, being students, were prone to roam about late at night, doing the same things they do today, drinking and carousing and not getting their studies done. The werewolves were doing away with the late night fun, so the students decided to do something about it. Young kids. They think they have answers to questions and they don't even know what the questions are. The students went out to deal with the werewolves, and a lot more young men were killed and probably eaten. Someone came up with the idea of using silver, taken from clothing or jewelry or anything that they could find that had actual silver, and making bullets to hunt down these monsters. The beast of Javadon was still 124 years in the future. Silver has been associated with God and keeping the monsters at bay. In the Bible, silver holds symbolic significance and is mentioned numerous times throughout the scriptures. It is often used to represent purity, redemption, and righteousness. It stands to reason that somebody would come to the conclusion that silver could kill a werewolf. In times long ago, werewolves were killed by just about any means at hand. It just took a lot more effort and a lot more wounds to put one down. Any bullets would do the job as long as you used enough of them and hit the right spots. The werewolves in Greifswald were killed or driven off by the students using silver bullets. Many retreated into the forests surrounding the town. I used to tell people that the first time a silver bullet was mentioned was the Beast of Jevadon. Well, I don't know everything. I'm only 100% right about 40% of the time. When people begin thinking they know everything, they become stupid. Werewolves in Sweden and Norway were called Varlov. Eastern Europe is particularly rich with werewolf folklore. The Varlov was described as being half wolf and half man, but they never called it a wolf man. The Verlov could transform any time they wished, day or night. To do this, they stripped down to their birthday suit and placed a wolf belt around their waist. This belt was either made from wolf skin or human, depending on which story you read. There's an entire process that you have to go through in order to make the wolf's belt. You need to remove the skin while the person is still alive. It has to be tanned using certain herbs, certain secret herbs. None of the werewolves' victims ever changed into beasts. The image of a man being terrorized by his knowledge of his coming transformation, well, that didn't apply here. The werewolves loved his ability and he used them as often as he could. He had made a deal with the devil. To the early Slavs, the wolf was a symbol of gods, such as Dadsbog, the white wolf. It symbolized the ferocity of nature and was meant to be respected and often revered. The wolf also howls at the moon and was believed to have some connection to the phases of the moon. That's where the idea of a wolf changing on a full moon comes from. And now, the rest of the story. Wolves that do not howl at the moon. They howl to communicate with others, and the moon just happens to be there. Sometimes it's in the sky, and sometimes it's not. There is no connection. The combination of fear and worship was common for the early Slavs with both the gods and creatures such as wolves and bears. While the bear was often considered more kingly, the wolf was an aggressive outsider willing to strike the shepherd's flocks. This brought on a fear of outsiders. Nearly every Slavic village in pagan times was unfortified, and an invader could strike at any time. This combination of the fear of both wolves and men manifested in one form of the Wilkotal, Wilkolak, or the wolf man. In some legends, werewolves were undead, cursed people who returned after their death to prey on the villagers and their flocks. In other legends, werewolves were living people with secret abilities. There was also a connection between eating wolf meat and turning into a werewolf. In some cases, the wolf had been cursed, and by eating it, you took on this curse. If the werewolf killed a farm animal and the owner consumed the remains, this could also cause an unwanted transformation. The idea of becoming a werewolf due to having been bitten was also found in a few locations, but not many. The seventh son of a seventh son was considered to be cursed. You had no choice in the matter. If your folks did not stop at number 6 and you came along and you just happened to have 6 older brothers, too bad, so sad. If your parents were bad people, you might become a werewolf as their punishment. They would have a bad kid to deal with, a very bad kid. Should the pregnant woman give birth while on unholy ground, the offspring might become a beast. If born on the wrong day or night, you were destined to have a colorful, exciting life while attacking your neighbors. The ways of becoming a creature of the night that didn't only run around at night were numerous. The one thing that was constant was you became some kind of a beast. Hitler and his minions were looking for ways to overpower the world. They searched out sacred relics from any country that they had conquered. Once in their possession, scientists or occultists would study these items to see how they could be used as weapons. When Rudolf Hess made that epic flight in May 1941, Hitler announced all occult materials were verboten. Was this because he had changed his mind about such things, or was this just another example of only for me and not for thee? There are dozens of examples of the Nazis still looking into and researching occult knowledge long after Hess was in British custody. Occult and esoteric ideas became deeply embedded in Russian culture long before the Bolshevik Revolution. After the revolution, occult ideas were manifest in literature and the humanities and the sciences as well. Although the Soviet government discouraged and eventually prohibited metaphysical speculation, that same government used occult for its own purposes and even funded research into it. Stalin was considered to be not a fan of the occult, but then he might have acted this way because his adversaries were so into it. Enemy countries hear stories from their spies on how the folks over there are studying some bizarre, unbelievable documents or legends. This leads to a need to study the same things in the hopes of either beating the bad guys to the discovery of some new powerful weapon, or to be able to prove beyond any doubt the legends are nothing to worry about. Werewolves were legendary throughout Europe and Asia. The first consideration would be how to find them or make your own. The second would be how do you control these monsters once you've made them? In the rush to create the first nuclear bomb, some scientists thought it just might destroy the world. Others said, let's push that button and see what happens. Hitler and Stalin both wanted the land in between them, and at first they divided it up. The people living there had legends about monsters, and the armies would have known them if not believed the same things. Once Hitler decided to invade Russia, him and Stalin wanted everything, not just the land between them. Those doing the fighting and dying were just there to serve the cause. How do you go about capturing a werewolf? And then go about convincing it to do your bidding. The way I'd do it, if I was in charge, which I never am, is somehow I would capture or kill the creature. Then I would use its blood and infect or inject voluntold to see what happened. Have them well strapped down, and I would not use the big, strong soldiers. I would get a bunch of puny little people that, if they did get out of hand, they'd be easy to deal with. Lots of security, lots of men with rifles and silver bullets standing around just on the safe side, if not maybe having a shock collar with a hand grenade attached to it, something like that. But then I'm a little bit paranoid. Cusca Castle was built in the second half of the 13th century on orders from the Bohemian ruler Otakar II. The castle looks as if it's been built inside out. All of the big stones are around the interior courtyard where there are no windows. The outer walls have dozens of windows and they don't look like any kind of fortification. The castle appears to have been built not to keep people out, but something in. In the middle of the courtyard is a well that many say leads straight down to hell. During World War II, the Wehrmacht occupied the castle until 1945. The Nazis were there to conduct experiments into the occult. There are stories about what the Nazis hoped to gain in the castle in the middle of nowhere. After the war, researchers did some digging around the outer walls. They uncovered the bodies of numerous mid to high ranking Nazi soldiers. These men had no obvious signs of how they had been killed. No broken bones, no gunshot wounds, just speculation on my part. Could these fanatics have volunteered to allow something to inhabit them in order to further the conquest of the world? The Nazis loved performing human experiments, mostly on Jewish prisoners. It would be foolhardy to try turning a prisoner into a monster that would more than likely turn on you as soon as it could. By using men who already had shaky grasp on right and wrong, but a fanatical alliance to the cause, maybe the scientists hoped they would be able to control these creatures. Were they successful? Maybe. On Paranormal Roundtable, Josh Turner told about a man he met who told stories from his grandfather. Yes, I'm wearing one of his shirts. His grandfather was from Belarus, and he was pressed into service in the German army. The Germans treated him fairly well, seeing as the Soviets were not nice at all. The Germans treated them very nice. They were not like slapped on the back and called good soldiers, but they got food and guns. During the confusion of battle, he, along with many of his fellow conscripts, were taken prisoners by the Soviets. During the night, something would sneak in, killing off men on both sides of the conflict. A soldier would be there on night sentry duty, and he would vanish in the wink of an eye. At one point in the fighting, the grandfather saw huge paw prints that looked like a wolf of unheard of proportions had just walked by only on 2 feet. Go look for Werewolf Attacks of World War II from March 19th, 2024. It should keep you awake all night, maybe a few nights. A very good story and a very good storytelling. That's on Paranormal Roundtable with Josh Turner. If, as if battle wasn't scary enough, having a shape-shifting monster to deal with is just a little too much. Legends of curses and magic belts might have been scrutinized by the Nazi Party, who decided, hey, let's give this a try. What could possibly go wrong? And not to be left behind in a magical weapons race, the Soviets would have looked into these creatures as well. While the Nazis would have carefully sorted out which soldiers to try their transformation experiments on, the Soviets were not so worried about who to use. A quantity over quality. Most of the labs or the facilities used were far from any major cities. The folks in charge didn't want their tinkerings to escape and cause death and destruction to their own country. Should something go wrong, the entire area could be sterilized using either bombs or flamethrowers. If that didn't work, well, simply ignore what you'd done and pretend like you have no idea. Just as long as the world never learned who was to blame. By placing the facilities close to the front line, the proximity to the fighting would allow the secret weapons to simply walk or run out the door and start killing the enemy, or whoever they came in contact with. No one needed to transport these creatures, adding to the possibility of an accident or an escape. In the early hours of November 1944, a platoon of German soldiers were making their ways through the dense forests in the Ardennes. They were part of the German counteroffensive against the Allied forces in what would later be called the Battle of the Bulge. For those of you that don't read a lot of history about World War II, the line was pretty much straight across Europe, where the Allies on one side and the Germans on the other side. And then the German forces started to push forward in the Ardennes and they created a huge bulge in the line. And that's where they got the name from. As these German soldiers were moving through the trees, the forest was eerily silent, with only the crunch of snow underfoot, and then once a while somebody breathing. As they trudged through the snow, the men heard blood-curdling howls, maybe more than one, coming from somewhere deep in the forest. They stopped in their tracks, their hearts pounding in their chests. They had heard rumors of werewolves, supernatural creatures that were said to roam the forests of Europe, but they'd always dismissed these as mere superstition. As they stood frozen in fear, they began to wonder. Maybe there was some truth in these peasant stories. Maybe they weren't just legends. A shadowy figure appeared out of the woods. It was too dark to make out any details, but it seemed to be a very large person with wolf-like features. It was standing on its hind legs. The men raised their guns, but before they could fire a single shot, the creature attacked. The soldiers fought back with all of their might, but they were no match for this powerful beast. One by one they fell, their screams echoing through the forest. When the sun finally came up the next morning, only one man was still alive. He was terrified beyond any ability to speak. He was covered from head to foot with blood, and none of it was his own. It was all that of his fellow soldiers, who were all in pieces around him. He figured this had to have been some kind of a shapeshifter that was allied to either side. Perhaps it was a farmer that had avoided being pressed into service, or some deserter, maybe. Maybe this creature was a regular soldier that wasn't concerned about which side his victims were on, as long as they were there for his or her pleasure. The surviving soldier reported back to his superior officers and he told them what had happened to his unit, and they immediately dismissed anything he said, figuring he was just stressed out by seeing all of his friends and fellow soldiers killed. The official story was that this platoon was simply missing in action. Their families were left to wonder whatever happened to so and so. He had such a promising career in the Nazi army. Rumors of werewolves continued to spread among the German troops. Some said to have seen these creatures themselves, while others dismissed the whole thing as just peasant nonsense. Still, there was an air of unease that hung over all of the soldiers, as if they were being stalked by some kind of an unseen predator. Now you not only had to watch your front for the enemy, you had to watch your back for the monsters. It's easy to say nonsense while sitting in a well lit room. Go sit in a pitch black forest and then say, oh, yeah, it's nothing but old stories. The Soviets were far to the east. The US and the British armies were to the west. Could this have been some kind of a US or British secret weapon that walked on two legs? Would the US use such a monster? The end justifies the means, and the US was no different from the Axis countries when it came to trying new and exciting things in the name of winning. A werewolf attacking German troops on the Eastern Front would have come from the Soviets. A werewolf coming from the West had to have been created by the US or the British, or it had to be a creature that was not aligned to either side. As the war raged on, the legends of werewolves grew. Some believed that the creatures were the results of Nazi experiments, while others thought they were ancient beasts that have been awakened by the war. Regardless of their origin, the soldiers knew that they needed to be prepared for anything, including the possibility of being attacked by a monster in the middle of the night. In the end, the German counteroffensive was unsuccessful and the Allied forces emerged victorious. The Germans really ran out of gas. That's what stopped them. But the legend of the werewolves lived on, a haunting reminder of the horrors of war. Years later, as the world tried to come to terms with the nasty, horrible things done during the war, not just by the Germans, but by, both sides did some really bad things. A group of historians stumbled upon the report of this surviving soldier in the archives. It was a first-hand account of a werewolf attack written by that lone private. Suddenly, the legend had a shred of credibility, and people began to wonder if there was any truth to all of the old stories that you find all over Europe. To this day, the legend of the werewolf remains a mystery. Some believe it was simply a case of mass hysteria brought on by the stresses of war. Others think there might be some truth to this story. Whatever the case, the legend serves as a haunting reminder that some of the horrors of war are not just done by soldiers. The strange and inexplicable things that can happen in times of great conflict. Stories of peasants turning to cannibalism to survive. Lots of nasty things. American intelligence officer Frank Manuel started seeing a symbol near the end of the war. It was etched across the walls in Franconia region of Germany. A straight vertical line intersected by a horizontal line with a hook on it. Most members of the Counterintelligence Corps kind of considered that this was a swastika that was drawn in a hurry and the person drawing it didn't have time to finish. However, Manuel had other ideas and he wrote about it in his logbook. To him, the mark referred to the Werewolves, a German guerrilla fighting group that was prepared to strike down any isolated soldier that they came across. The MPs that was on patrol. Some fool who went out after hours and didn't have anyone with him. In the final months of World War II, as the Allied troops were pushing deeper into the Nazi controlled areas of Germany, and then the Soviet Union, they were kind of blocking everything to the east. The the Nazi generals and the colonels, they needed something to slow down this invasion. Hitler and his senior officials were looking for anything that they could use to slow down the Allied attack. Out of desperation, they turned to the supernatural for inspiration. They created two large, separate movements. One was an official group of paramilitary soldiers. The other was going to be made up of civilians. Neither of these groups actually achieved very much in the way of success, but both of them managed to put a lot of fear and anxiety into any of the troops that knew of them. From the start of the war, Hitler had pulled from Germanic folklore and the occult legends to supplement Nazi propaganda. High level Nazis researched everything from the Holy Grail to witchcraft. Among these mythological fascinations were werewolves. According to some 19th and early 20th century German folklorists, werewolves represented flawed but well meaning characters who may be bestial but are tied to the woods, the blood, and the soil. They represented German strength and purity against interlopers. These were good Germans who would be willing to fight for the fatherland. We're talking werewolves here. It was an image Hitler harnessed repeatedly from the name of one of his Eastern Front headquarters, the Wolf's Lair, to the implementation of Operation Werewolf. Towards the end of 1944, plans for Nazi SS Lieutenant Adolf Putzmann and Otto Skorzeny were going to infiltrate Allied camps and sabotage supply lines using this paramilitary group. They had rounded up any German soldier that could speak English. They were going to train them, dress them in American uniforms, issue them American equipment, and then parachute them behind U.S. lines. As Skorzeny had already proven the value of using small, specialized units when he had successfully managed to rescue Mussolini, who was being held in an Italian prison. The original strategy was from 1944 and into 45. They didn't think they're going to win the war anymore. They simply wanted to slow down the advance to either A, be able to negotiate a truce with the US and the British, or B, they wanted to have enough time to pack their bags and escape to South America by way of Spain. Also, some of them were going to head to the Middle East. The werewolf fighters were going to be supplied with the newest and most wonderful weapons that would give them an advantage over the enemies. In reality, the werewolf soldiers were lucky if they got a rifle or a machine gun, a hand grenade if they were really lucky. In other words, these super specialized soldiers weren't even being supplied. The second attempt of the werewolves was from the Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels. This time, he was far more successful. He began to reach out to the citizens by radio, urging all German citizens they should join the werewolf movement. They were going to fight against the Allies who were invading the fatherland. They were going to be good German citizens. There was a female broadcaster, a radio personality, I guess you'd call her, as she came on the radio and said, let me see if I can do this with a German accent. Maybe I shouldn't. No, I'm not gonna. She said, I am so savage. I am filled with rage. Lily the werewolf is my name. I bite, I eat, I am not tame. My werewolf teeth will bite the enemy. It's kind of funny. It was okay for Germany to invade Poland and France and Belgium and all the other countries, but it wasn't okay for anybody to invade them. Hmm. The folks being recruited were already kind of worn out from all the fighting that had happened over the last 7 years. A lot of them hadn't seen a decent meal in a long time. The few recruits that they were able to get were a lot of very young, very impressionable people. People that were easily swayed into doing things. They set up snipers to fire at any Allied soldiers, and they used assassins to kill any German mayors who had agreed to work with the Allies. They also attacked their own citizens if they thought that these people were being too friendly to the Americans or the British. A General Patton said, this threat of werewolves and murder is a bunch of bunk. Well, the American media and the military took the threat of these partisan fighters a little more seriously. One U.S. intelligence report from May 1945 asserted the werewolf organization is not a myth. Some American authorities saw these bands of guerrilla fighters as one of the greatest threats to the security in both the American and the Allied zones of occupation. Once again, not only do you have to watch the front for the enemy, but now you have to watch your back for these pretend werewolves that might try to kill you. Newspapers ran headlines saying, the fury of the Nazis, the werewolves, to be unleashed on the invaders. They also wrote about an army of civilians who were going to drive away the conquering Allied forces. The Third Reich was going to keep the Allies out of Germany somehow. In the Pocket Guide for Germany, the U.S. military emphasized the need for caution when dealing with teenagers. Soldiers on the ground reacted strongly to even a hint of sabotage. In June 1945, two German teenagers, Hans Petri and Joseph Schroner, were executed by an American firing squad for espionage that they had pulled off against the U.S. military. While the werewolf propaganda achieved Goebbels' goal of intimidating Allied forces, it did nothing to help the German citizens. It stoked fears, it lied about the situation, and it lured many to fight for a lost cause. The werewolf campaign endangered more German citizens than Allied troops. Local acts of terror continued up until 1947, 2 years after the surrender. Several thousand casualties were likely the result of these werewolf fighters, either directly uh, by means of being killed by them or by some of the booby traps that they were setting all over the place. As Germany slowly began to stabilize, fewer and fewer of these partisans actually attacked the soldiers or their own citizens. Within a few years, the Nazi werewolves were no more than a strange memory left for a lot of people to talk about as they grow old. Werewolf wannabes in the form of young, misguided killers, or the real thing, sneaking about the forest, killing off any targets of opportunity. How many soldiers had disappeared in the middle of the night with absolutely no trace of their remains ever being found? The folks in charge did not want anyone talking about or writing about monsters. As the war was grinding down, it was time to find a new war so the folks making weapons could continue to prosper. That military industrial complex must be fed. Generals didn't want their soldiers talking about these creatures. It was bad for morale. Any unexplained deaths were simply added to the casualties from normal death and destruction. Once the war was over, there was still unexplained deaths that had to be explained. Soldiers still went missing. Citizens still told stories about creatures running around that sounded an awful lot like werewolves. Soldiers returning to the States would quickly learn to edit what they talked about during their time in Europe. German scientists were being brought to the U.S. despite President Truman saying that no Nazis were allowed. The OSS simply changed their records so the boys in the white lab coats could be used to create new and exciting weapons to be used for the next conflict. Operation Paperclip. If the next conflict could not be found, there were places to get one started. Any weapons that might give the upper hand was being looked into. Not all the Nazi scientists wound up in the US. The Soviets managed to get their hands on many and ship them back to their secret purposes. If the Soviets already had werewolves of their own, would they need Nazi scientists to work on them? You can always make a weapon better. Perhaps the Soviets found the creatures they had unleashed on the Germans were too hard or even impossible to control. Any weapon is almost useless if you cannot control it. Perhaps the Nazis had managed to develop a monster that obeyed its masters. Perhaps the Soviets thought this was true and they wanted some of their own. Once you have a new technology, well, technology might not be the right word for it. Let's say a new toy. You want to play with it. You don't want to just leave it in the box. You want to take it out and see what it'll do. The US, British, and French were trying to get Germany back on their feet. The Soviets wanted retribution and as much monetary gain as they could squeeze out of their section of Germany. This led to the creation of the Iron Curtain and the division of Germany. West Germany prospered with the aid of the Big Three, while East Germany became a wasteland. The 4,300-mile border between what was known as the East and the West was filled with fences and walls and minefields and watchtowers. The Berlin Wall was just a small part of this physical barrier. The folks trapped on the wrong side of the curtain wanted desperately to escape. The folks who made their livings by collecting intelligence wanted to get into the East. Millions of dollars were spent on both sides trying to make this happen, and the Soviets spent millions trying to stop it. Berlin had been divided from east and west. A huge wall was built from the north side and it ran all the way to the south side of town. Barbed wire and mines were used to connect the wall's ends, running completely around West Berlin. Troops and equipment had to be driven through East Germany to get to West Berlin. There were checkpoints all along the way to be sure that nothing sneaky was going on, and the trip back was twice as hard. Berlin was deep inside East Germany, but it was also still controlled by the Soviets, the United States, the British, and the French. So all these US, British, and French troops had to move through East Germany to get to West Berlin. Uh, it's hard to describe. Look it up on a map. Eh. Anyway, the city is still considered to be occupied by all four countries. Western soldiers would be seen patrolling areas inside East Berlin, and East German soldiers were often seen in West Berlin. As much money as could be squeezed out of the folks in the name of keeping the world safe for capitalism or socialism in the form of taxes was being dumped into this area, but not for the folks living there. It was all in the name of military superiority. The wall and fence were patrolled day and night by soldiers on both sides, all watching for escapees or a military buildup. Should things have gone south, my unit had tanks already stationed in West Germany that we would climb onto and drive on the attack. I'll bet a bunch of nukes would have stopped that game plan in the first hour. The border was 4,300 miles long, 87 of which was actually the wall. The US Mexico border is 1,954 miles long. It is easy to get from one side to the other. Once out in the country, the border between East and West Europe was a fence and a few landmines. It would have taken thousands of soldiers or just a couple of werewolves to patrol this line. According to some stories I ran across, the Soviets used their werewolves all throughout the Soviet Union, not just in the cities, uh, not in the cities, but away from any big populated areas. Places where spies might have snuck into the Soviet or maybe citizens trying to sneak out. I kind of envision werewolves with shock collars running around. Some guard had to stop them from chewing on the fences or urinating on sensitive electronic equipment. I wonder what became of these beast soldiers once the Soviet Union went kaputsky. Now, I have listeners in Russia and several of the former Soviet countries. I have nothing against any of the folks who just wanted to live their lives. It's those politicians who think they have all the answers. They're the ones that need a good long spanking. I'm still wondering whatever became of the creatures let loose to patrol the border. If they are real werewolves, did they take on human form and slip away to some civilian job? Did they get absorbed by the regular army and now they're doing KP and police call along with all the other soldiers? Or did some bureaucrat decide that their very existence was too dangerous, both physically as well as to the future of said bureaucrat? As folks find out about the nasty things done to them and their friends and family, some are going to come seeking vengeance. Knowing one of your long lost relatives was eaten by a werewolf at the behest of the government just might annoy people. Add to this the way in which many Soviet military units dropped everything and ran for home base, kind of like what happened in August of 2021. Someone yelled, "Run away," and everybody did. Leave all those heavy weapons right there. I'm sure the folks coming along behind won't find any use for them. The person or people in charge should be made to pay for all that stuff that they left behind. Kind of like how I had to pay every time I lost an item of equipment. I had a pair of rubber boots, got a hole in them. I had to pay for the boots. Did a few Soviet werewolves find themselves in one of the many countries no longer a part of the Soviet Union? Just a thought. If you are a werewolf who got left behind, would you let me know? I'm interested. Some people look at the problem as it arose, did their best to survive. Some sold what little they had, while others got busy writing books or telling their stories. Victor Pelevin wrote A Werewolf Problem in Central Russia. The story's protagonist, Sasha, encounters a pack of werewolves who transform him in one of their own so they can do battle with an older werewolf. The narrator spends a lot of time detailing the sensations that Sasha experiences. Things like his heightened senses and a fast paced reality that are distinct from those of humans. To further emphasize these transformation aspects, Pelvin describes the human shapes rendered by wolves as their shadows in the moonlight. Much like the Livonian lycanthropy, Pelvin's werewolves are heroic, Ubermensch, who rely on instinct rather than rational thoughts or pre-established plans. Ubermensch is the superior human. Sasha, the new werewolf, im, im, yeah, Sasha, the new werewolf, is discovers that he has two choices available to Russians, like the perestroika. Try that again. Sasha, the new werewolf, is showing how people in the Russia and the Soviet Union had two choices available during perestroika, the reform or the collapse of the Soviet Union. Tupelevin represents his transformation into a bloodthirsty beast as a positive development, suggesting that only accepting inevitable change can produce improvement. This assumption did not outlast the 1990s, his second book, called The Sacred Book of Werewolves, that came out in 2004. Pelvin's post socialist lycanthropy is more demonic and deceitful than heroic. Like the Russian folk tales that at least partially inspired it, Pelvin's 1991 story also contains an underlying moral element that points to the circularity of transformation. Early in the tale, Sasha is confronted with a forked road and he takes what he believes is the right path. After walking for quite a while, he realizes that he has made a giant circle and he's now right back where he started. By the story's end, he figures out that from the beginning he was manipulated into encountering this werewolf pack. As is frequent in Pelvin's stories, freedom is an illusion, and individualism is barely distinguishable from joining a crowd, a swarm, or a pack. Choice that only appears to be true. I don't talk like that. I got this review from a web page I accidentally closed, and then I couldn't find it again. Whoever wrote it, thanks. That was very wordy and very hard for me to read. Now I need to get a copy of his book and read it. As for the US and werewolves, we've had reports for decades of werewolves coming in various names. Creature that look and act like wolfmen. The name Dogman got popular, and this has led to some folks trying to distinguish between the two. What is the difference between a dog and a wolf? Dogs have wider frames, floppy ears, shorter snouts, and smaller tails. Wolves have bigger paws, larger heads, stronger teeth and jaws. Wolves are the ancestors of all breeds of domesticated dogs, but hormonal changes have created behavior that is different in dogs from wolves. When M sees a person walking past our house, her inner wolf comes out. For such a small critter, she has a huge personality. except when she's asleep, like now. Now, what might be the difference between a werewolf and a dogman? If you're being chased through the woods by a 7 foot tall, hair covered monster that has a muzzle and hocks, those are the backwards bent legs, they're actually not the knees of a wolf. The knees of a wolf are just like everybody else's knees. What you're actually looking at, what people think are the backwards pointing knees, those are actually their ankles, and they're called hocks. Dogs and cats walk on their toes. Now I'm getting way too technical here, aren't I? Too much time and effort is spent trying to shoehorn cryptids into one box or another. For me, Dogman, Wolfman, they're the same thing. A werewolf changes from a man to a wolf and then runs on all fours, whereas a dogman and a wolfman, they travel around on 2 feet. Do they change? That I don't know. There have been sightings of tall creatures in and around military bases, things folks refer to as looking like a wolf man. Several have been seen near the Oak Ridge Particle Accelerator, Particle Collider in Tennessee. Tony Merkel talks about them on his show, The Confessionals. The boys in white lab coats are so fascinated by playing God, they sometimes forget things can get dangerous when they meddle in high places. Mixing DNA from one creature to another, or injecting blood from a dangerous monster into a soldier, just might lead to being a little too powerful, unstable mentally, and unable to control. What's that old saying? If you can dream it. I have to mention the monster du jour, skinwalkers. Just about every state has had people saying that they saw a Yinaldalushi. There have been folks talking about these creatures in Europe, of all places. People living on reservations are talking about some of the things that they're not supposed to talk about. A skinwalker can take on the shape of an animal by draping a pelt over his or her body. This sounds a lot like the wolf belt used in the Netherlands. I doubt any Indian witches are hanging out in all the places that people say they've seen some weird cryptids. The Verlov doesn't have a copyright on using an animal skin to transform, and neither does the skinwalker. At least, I don't think they do. One day, I got a nasty gram from YouTube saying I could not use copywritten material. They told me the title of my show about the Zodiac Killer was owned by someone else. Somebody got a copyright on a murderer's name from the 1960s? They said yes. I had to change the title by combining the two words, making it into one, Zodiac Killer, as opposed to Zodiac Killer. They were okay with that. I don't understand those people sometimes. Maybe one of these creatures is violating the other's ideas. Someday you're going to see a lawsuit between the skinwalkers and the werewolves from the Netherlands. I found a few reports from Texas I had never read before. One said that dogmen were able to lure people into the woods by mimicking somebody else's voice. This would move Dogman from just a cryptid into a whole new realm, such as not just paranormal, but supernatural. Werewolves are supernatural, while dogmen are cryptid. At least that's what a lot of people say. Many investigators say that dogmen are always dogmen, unable to switch from one form to the other. Werewolves are both and can change whenever they wish. Wolfmen are usually lumped in with the werewolves. December 2020. It was reported here in Texas. Christopher Whitley had been killed by a mountain lion in Hood County, southwest of Fort Worth. Whitley was found dead in the wooded area near his girlfriend's house. He was on his way to work on the morning of December 2nd. When he failed to show up for work, a friend filed a missing persons report. Whitley's body was found the next day in the opposite direction from the one that he should have gone if he was on his way to work that night. Wildlife officials say the evidence at the scene does not support a mountain lion attack. Officials from Texas Parks and Wildlife Department could not find any evidence of a mountain lion attack at the scene or on Whitley's body. Investigators found his body in a sandy area, yet there were only his footprints to be found. If this was not a mountain lion, then what did kill him? The investigation showed that he was attacked while he was standing up, and he died within seconds. His body had long scratches that did not come from a mountain lion, and his throat was ripped open by some massive teeth. But no one knows which animal or creature has anything like the ones used on Whitley's body. His shirt was missing, which is kind of bizarre. Who would take his shirt and why? Since his body was found, officials have come out saying it was and it was not a mountain lion attack. Hairs found during the investigation were discovered to be definitely canine hairs, but these samples all vanished during the subsequent investigation. The teeth marks were way too big for any dog known to man. Whitley's fingernails were clipped and examined for any DNA evidence. No known animal DNA was found, and the fingernails were then destroyed. The body was cleaned up from head to toe using bleach. This effectively destroyed any evidence that might have pointed out who the killer actually was. Someone is either trying to close this case despite unanswered questions, or there might be something out there looking for its next meal. I'm sure a lot of you are thinking this whole werewolf soldier idea is daft. There's no way the military would use such creatures to kill the enemy. Flamethrowers, flechette rounds, claymores, napalm, landmines, nukes, those are all acceptable ways of killing, but not being eaten by a werewolf. That's just too nasty. Add to this the problem of how could such things ever be made? There are folks out there trying to turn nanobots into killer swarms. Somebody is building robots that can think for themselves and decide who needs to be killed. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. It kind of got a little long there. Things I felt I just had to include. If you enjoyed it, tell your friends, tell your relatives, tell people you don't even know. They should be listening to Strange Things with Chris James. And until next week, see y'all later and try to get some sleep.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man who they say he murdered 3? Strange things have happened there. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.